Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. In a recently leaked Pentagon assessment of Taiwan's military as unlikely to thwart Chinese mainland military air superiority in a cross-strait conflict, highlights the weaknesses of Taiwan's air defense. So today, our guest is Ivan Kanapathy, a former White House National Security Council official who was posted in Taiwan as the U.S. military attaché. Ivan was a naval flight officer, a Top Gun instructor, and was deployed to the Middle East 5 times. Thank you for your service, and welcome, Ivan.
Thanks. It's great to be here, Wenqi.
So, is Taiwan prepared for a conflict?
I think that today, and really for a long time, Taiwan has been and continues to be prepared for a conflict. I think the concern that a lot of folks, including myself, but other folks in Washington have, is whether Taiwan will continue to be prepared as China continues to build new capabilities.
So it's the new capabilities that worry Washington, D.C. In other words, Taiwan also needs to build up its own new capabilities. Is that right?
That's right. So you've probably heard several American officials talk about different timelines, but I think the sum of the comments from U.S. government analysis is that towards the end of this decade, China will really have an ability to attack and take over Taiwan if they so choose to execute it. And the real question is Taiwan going to build the capabilities to counter that and prevent that from happening?
Well, in that vein of thought, some in Washington, D.C. also worry about the Ukraine-Russia war for depleting U.S. ammunition stockpiles. And of course, that will impact military supply to Taiwan. And a recent Taiwan news report revealed that U.S.-Taiwan may jointly produce drones and ammunition. What does all that mean?
Yeah, I think, nobody knows what Xi Jinping's timeline and if for sure that he's going to do something. But I think most people feel that there hopefully at least are a couple years of hard work that can be accomplished to fix some of these problems we've seen that the Ukraine war has exposed in our own defense industrial base capacity, both the United States and probably also in Taiwan. The number of munitions that Taiwan has on island is extremely insufficient. It's way below the numbers required to even hold off, a future PLA attempt to take Taiwan. But so it's quite critical that Taiwan, in cooperation with the United States and hopefully other countries, build up its supply of critical munitions to defend.
So does that mean you would advocate for more arms sales to Taiwan in the near future?
Yeah, I mean, for example, I think, on the U.S. side, we've thus far failed to deliver, for example, the Stinger, shoulder launch missile to Taiwan, which I was involved in some of these decisions to provide arms, but we decided to sell 250. I think Taiwan requested many years ago in 2015, another 250 when I was at the White House in 2019, I believe. But really, even 500 is probably not enough. And so we need to be increasing numbers of maybe not necessarily that munition, but things like that can really help deny the ability of the People's Liberation Army to establish itself, on Taiwan.
Well, to the extent that you can, since there's always, the number or the equipments that Taiwan would like to request vis-a-vis what the U.S. would provide or sell. What was the decision-making process like?
So I think historically, definitely before the Ukraine war, the Taiwan military was a little too focused on platforms, large platforms. The United States would prefer that Taiwan focus on more munitions. I think the Ukraine war has borne out, I think, the U.S. view quite strongly. And when you look at a scenario in the environment that Taiwan sits in, large platforms, and when I say platforms, I mean sort of big naval vessels and aircraft, manned aircraft, fighter planes, transport aircraft, those are extremely vulnerable and not likely to survive for very long. And so sort of ground-based and maybe coastal-based munitions are probably a smarter purchase from a cost-effectiveness standpoint. And I think since Ukraine, Taiwan is starting to align more with that view.
Well, you obviously know Taiwan's defense really well, and were posted from 2014 to 2017 at AIT as the military attaché. And you recently visited Taiwan with the think tank, Global Taiwan Institute. Any thoughts you'd like to share from that trip, and has anything changed from, the last trip and the time you were posted in Taipei?
Yeah, no, I'm increasingly optimistic, I think, about Taiwan. And I can tell you that there were a lot of questions that Washington had, and quite frankly, I myself had when I lived in Taiwan from 2014 to 17 about, that question, that unanswerable question of what is Taiwan's will to fight, right? What is the Taiwanese people's will to fight? Because really that's a critical part of how long, Taiwan would survive. And if you look at what happened in Ukraine, I think the whole world, except for the Ukrainians, thought that they would collapse in a matter of days. But I think largely because they had a will to fight, that's not what happened. And they're still fighting, if not, starting to win the war, 13, 14 months later. And my view of observations in Taiwan is that, especially the younger generations in Taiwan, increasingly are vocal, displaying, and actually taking actions like grassroots types of civil preparedness organizations. You see that folks really do have a will to defend, the way of life that they have now in Taiwan.
And do you think that level of will or willingness to fight needs to almost be elevated to the level of Israel's? Because there's a lot of debate how Taiwan should be militarized like Israel. What is your view on that?
So I think Taiwan could do more. I support what President Tsai did with re-extending conscription. When I lived there, conscription was a year. It went down, and now it's gone back up to a year, right? And I understand that was by popular demand that it was reduced. But again, it seems like the polling indicates that most Taiwanese support bringing it back to 1 year. The most important question, though, of course, is whether the training that recruits are put through during that, whether it's 4 months or whether it's 12 months, is quality training or not. And that will require some investment on Taiwan's part. I mean, nothing comes for free. And, Taiwan through the legislative yuan will have to devote some resources, because if folks, if young people go into this, whether it's 4 months or 12 months, and come out of it having felt that they haven't learned something, they're not better prepared, or they've been wasting their time, then it doesn't matter how long conscription is, right? It's really more about the quality than the duration.
Yeah, and in Taiwan, I'm sure you're aware of, there's also another school of thought, which is this kind of preparedness is almost, is a way to provoke China by strengthening defense and more or less, being more aligned with the U.S. side. Rather, there's another sort of kind of team who advocates for better dialogue with Beijing. And how do you think about these two approaches?
Yeah, so I think that there's no reason not to be prepared. I don't think anybody in the United States, me included, is opposed to dialogue. But I think, as you know, Beijing's dialogue often has preconditions. One of those preconditions being one that the current government in Taiwan, obviously isn't willing to make. So regardless of whether you have dialogue with Beijing, I think that dialogue is significantly strengthened if you have a credible deterrence. And so continuing to have, which again, today, I think Beijing is deterred. But the question is, will they continue to be as China invests in the capabilities, to consummate an invasion? So, if China's continuing to build those things, it seems quite reasonable that Taiwan should continue to invest in defense to extend its own deterrence capabilities.
Well, and speaking of dialogue, so, in 2015, former President Ma and Xi Jinping actually had a dialogue in Singapore, and you were in Taipei at that time. And fast forward, now the relationship is quite different. And as a longtime, practitioner and observer of Taiwan and Taiwan's security affairs, what has really changed fundamentally these relationships? And would you say, and you served actually in the Trump White House, which is credited for, really pivoting and changing sort of the policy towards China. So, and then we see the continuity in the Biden administration when it comes to Taiwan and China policy. Would you agree that first, there's continuity, and then second, just your assessment about, what fundamentally has changed between U.S. and China, and of course, U.S. and Taiwan as well?
Yeah, I think there is continuity, and I don't think it's a question as much of, President Obama or President Trump or President Biden. It's a question of really the direction that became evident that China was taking. So if anything, it's a Xi Jinping question, right? That's what creates the consistency across U.S. policy. I think, in Taiwan, a lot of younger generation recognized what we really had evolving in Beijing before even the United States recognized it. And that was evident in the Sunflower Movement, right, in 2014, and sort of a wholesale rejection of some of the policies that the Ma administration was moving toward. And, that played out, obviously, in Taiwan's own elections, but then that view was vindicated. The United States started to take more of that view I would say really at the end of the Obama administration, the very end, but definitely in the Trump administration, right? 2017 and into 2018. And all those views were all vindicated, right, with what happened in Hong Kong, and a number of other events that were driven really by Chinese policy and China's policies. And we're seeing sort of China's rhetorical, at least, partnership with Russia over the Ukraine war. And that has really, I think, pushed general consensus far to the side that we really need to be prepared and deterring against aggression from Xi Jinping and the People's Republic of China.
Well, given that this particular argument that it's China that's making the move and becoming more aggressive, so there's also some advocacy around whether the U.S. should continue to have this strategic ambiguity policy. And you actually have argued that Taiwan doesn't need a formal U.S. security guarantee, and that maintaining strategic ambiguity is a better U.S. policy. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. It's a question of implementation of the policy. So I think where we sit today is actually a pretty good place. In other words, where President Biden has been asked, quite directly, and I think at least the last time he was asked, quite clear in his response, and hopefully, nobody in his administration was going to contradict that. And I think the last time we did finally arrive, that his answer was yes, he is going to send the U.S. military to help defend Taiwan. I think leaving at that is a good place. Going further,
however, the White House has come out to clear and say, well, the one China policy hasn't changed, and
No, that's right. And that's right. So the one China policy is separate and distinct, I think, from strategic ambiguity. And so I think there was a policy change, and President Biden articulated and said, yes, it is my intent, as the commander in chief, to do that. Now, that's still not quite full strategic clarity, meaning it's not the same as a defense treaty, right?
But it certainly was not ambiguity either.
I agree. No, I agree. It's probably not ambiguity. I think some of that ambiguity has gone away, but I think in a good way. But I think moving further, for example, toward a formal declaration or defense treaty, just creates a lot of questions and problems that we don't need to encounter. For example, what becomes the status of Jinmen Masu would be one question. And then would you have to put a clause in? He was asked the question is how Biden was asked how he would respond to China aggression or Chinese attack, right? Obviously, there's always this conditional caveat of, well, what if Taiwan declares independence or does something provocative? And then everyone in Washington generally says, well, then that's all bets are off. Then the U.S. doesn't have to help Taiwan, right? And so how do you write that into a treaty in a normal fashion? I think that's becomes a challenge also. And so I think where we sit right now, and hopefully the next president would answer the question the same way that President Biden did. I would encourage the next president to do the same. And that type of clarity is what I would advocate for you. Just a verbal clarity.
Yeah, so it's almost like everyone believes the U.S. will intervene, and that in and of itself is enough to deter without changing anything formally.
Well, it is because even I think a piece of paper or even what the president says, I think one of the problems he has is for the United States is we have to be able to credibly back it up.
Yes.
And we may not quite be there at this moment in time. And also the United States needs to readjust its posture, develop new weapons, deploy new weapons, probably increase our own defense spending in order to more credibly be in a position to execute like he promises.
Well, going beyond Taiwan, obviously the Indo-Pacific region, we've seen a lot of strengthening of defense with our allies, some from Japan and Australia to the Philippines. Obviously, a stronger U.S. security alliance in the region serves to deter China from invading Taiwan. But China, is also beefing up its PLA modernization. So, just with this kind of military buildup, are you worried about any incident?
Yeah, I think we have to be concerned about incidents, at sea or in the air. And I think, the United States is generally quite careful and tries to be professional. The PLA has obviously in the last year or two had several incidents, both with the United States, but also with some U.S. allies, Australia, I believe, Canada, that really raised some questions about their overall intentions. These things could cause accidents, which could obviously be escalatory. Taiwan, I think in particular, needs to be quite careful and not put themselves in a situation where in some ways I would suggest that the PLA might be setting up a trap, right, in order to prove a point. And I think, the Taiwanese military needs to think very hard about, exactly where and when it chooses to challenge some of these operations that PLA is executing, especially as most of them are, I think, all technically in international waters.
So at what point, as just a layperson who doesn't know much about military and defense, at what point should Taiwan respond? Because what we've seen is over the last, couple years, just crossing the middle line is almost like a daily routine now.
Yeah.
What else?
No, it is. And part of this is, a lot of this is historical, Chi. And, I understand that Taiwan, it's a matter of professional pride, and I worked with the Taiwanese military for more than 3 years. As these norms erode,
yes,
that it can be, I think, from a pride standpoint, difficult to accept. But I think Taiwan also needs to look at what are international laws and norms, not just the norms across the strait, and that China's military, we've known for many, many years, was going to continue to build. Their power projection capability, meaning their Navy and Air Force, was growing. We've seen this trend for years and years and years. And so the expectation, I think, no one should be even remotely surprised that they're flying more aircraft and driving more ships, right? They're building so many more. And where are they going to operate them? They're going to operate them off their coast. And guess what? Taiwan sits square right directly off China's coast. And so they have the capability. They're exercising it. It is international waters. So I think there are limited options for Taiwan, quite frankly, to try to respond. And by respond, I mean, it seems not realistic to try to roll back history, to a time when the Taiwanese Air Force outmatched the Chinese Air Force, because that's just not the situation today, right? And so to try to roll back and pretend that we're living in that world doesn't, when these lines were drawn on the ground, which was when the US and ROC still had an alliance, right? And we were flying our aircraft in and out of Taiwanese bases. That world doesn't exist anymore. And I think we need to be more realistic about what air and sea space needs to be defended. Kind of like I think Japan is more realistic about, Diaoyutai. For example, they tend to respond at the contiguous zone at 24 miles, territorial seas at 12 nautical miles. They don't really respond to incursions beyond those ranges.
Well, I think the international society would also agree that President Tsai has managed the past, I would say, at least one serious crisis calmly and relatively well. And so, her term is up, and the big question is who will be Taiwan's next leader? And Taiwan's ruling party, DPP, just formally nominated the current Vice President, William Lai, as the party's nominee. And you were actually quoted earlier this year in Financial Times for saying there are, concerns in Washington, D.C. about his experience and that of his advisors on international or cross-strait affairs. What are those concerns?
So I think there were, and maybe still are, some concerns that I've heard that aren't necessarily my view. They're not my view. That, some past statements that Leisinger has made, I think, about being a practical independence worker is the typical one that people raise. And he's, obviously comes from the New Tide faction. I think everybody kind of knows that tends to be more independence leaning within the party. Those concerns, I think, in Washington are just concerns about what he may or may not say in the course of the campaign, or even if he's elected president, that may be unnecessarily provoking, toward Beijing.
So what?
Those are the primary concerns. Yeah.
Yeah. So what, in Washington's view, is the behavior or statement that signifies the intent to declare independence? Because, you can say a lot of what President Tsai's actions also in some way signal Taiwan's sovereignty. It's just, I think people are pretty confident that she would never declare independence in that sense, right? So is it a matter of what you say and publicly announce, or there's something else?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. There's nothing defined here in the United States, and I think there are different opinions here in Washington about what may or may not be acceptable. I personally think that William Lai has conducted himself, and I've said this publicly before, very professionally. When he came to the White House in 2020, he met with us, and I think he had a very good grasp of the cross-trade situation at that time. And I think that, the speech he just gave when he accepted the party's nomination was very much in line with what President Tsai has said over the years. And I think his intention is to continue, to articulate a very similar, if not the exact same, cross-strait policy that President Tsai Ing-wen has, I think, very successfully managed over the past few years. And I think if that's the case, then Washington probably doesn't have a lot to worry about.
And so, let's say if he were to become Taiwan's next president, do you think a cross-strait dialogue is possible? And will the U.S. play any role in facilitating such dialogue?
Yeah, so anything's possible, but I don't think it's likely, and that's because of Beijing. I don't think Beijing will want to engage with the DPP, frankly. I think they'll continue to hold that line after this election. The U.S. will continue to just encourage both sides of the strait to have dialogue, as we've done in the past, but we won't serve. I would assume the U.S. government will not serve as an interlocutor, and that's part of actually, the 6 assurances. It's better for the United States. This is a matter for the two sides to work out on their own. And again, I think the responsible thing that we would all like to think is that Beijing would engage in dialogue in some fashion, regardless of who's elected in Taipei. But I don't hold a lot of hope for that.
And if it was a KMT president, would Washington, D.C. be worried that Taipei may be inching towards too closely to Beijing?
No, I don't think that's true either. So I think in today's terms, the KMT, in order to win in Taiwan, rather, I believe, will have to take a line that is, not as pro-China as you might see from former President Ma, right? They'll have to, take a line that's a little more moderate. And it's the same thing. Tsai Ing-wen took a line that was quite a bit more moderate than her predecessor, Chen Shui-bian, right? And I think those lessons have been learned. So I think both parties, I would expect, through campaign and also once elected through governance, will largely be status quo parties, with slight differences, but not very radical approaches. And in that case, Washington, that's really the best that Washington could hope for.
Well, last question. Your top predictions of the Taiwan Strait over the next year, including China's actions approaching Taiwan's presidential election.
Yeah, so I think actually that the next year will be relatively calm, and we've seen that already with the McCarthy meeting. I don't expect Speaker McCarthy to go to Taiwan this year. I think maybe next year he might, but we'll see. And And I think that most importantly, Beijing understands that there's an election in January in Taipei. And a lot of the actions that Beijing takes tend to be counterproductive for their own goals, right? Beijing probably does prefer to see a KMT victory, right? They don't try to hide that. And so they might actually be a little bit restrained, especially the latter half of the year. It'll be interesting to watch Xi Jinping's speech January 1st or 2nd, right? Which will be right before the Taiwanese election. And he'll give his speech. It'll be every 5 years, he gives a speech about Taiwan. So it'll be interesting to see how much he emphasizes, equal one country, two systems, because that will obviously stir up sentiment on Taiwan and could affect the election. But I think overall, things will be relatively calm. One, because Beijing understands the election, but two, also because China, as you've seen, is really trying to re-engage with the world from an economic standpoint. And so they have to be a little more restrained in their aggression, I guess, in order to attract foreign direct investment and things like that back into China.
Well, with that, thank you so much for speaking to TVBS Meeting Room today and sharing your, long-time expert analysis and observation of Taiwan's security affairs. Take care.
Thanks so much, Munchi. Great to be with you today.
Yeah, thank you. I thought that was great. Right on time, too.